Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
So, when we talk about economy and society, we are actually talking about the values of the economy and the values of society, and we are arguing that economics proposes a set of values which are quite often contrary to the values that the society cherishes. But actually what happens is that the values of the economy, which are now we are they are talking about sin goods, regarding those values which they think are not really should not really be encouraged. What is essential to keep in mind is that quite often the values that the economy promotes are not appreciate or are not the values that the society would like to encourage. And this is a major problem in contemporary society. This is a major problem that all societies face. That is why societies do not want to give a free hand to economies, to economies, because they think that if you give a free hand to economies, they will undermine the basic values of society. For instance, Iranian thinkers talk about Westoxification. Westoxification refers to the values of the so-called Western societies, which are supposed to have poisoned the minds of the societies which have come under the influence of West, and societies which have been affected by Western model of development. This is not only confined to Iran intellectuals. For that Mahatma Gandhi, he wrote this wrote this essay on Swaraj, Hind Swaraj. In this, Mahatma Gandhi said, rejected the notion of economic development that Western imperialism brought to India. He said that the Western industrialization has created a culture of desire, a culture where we want more and more of things. Whereas he says that a good civilization is one which restrains wants and controls wants. So, as a matter of fact, he gave emphasis on reduction of wants and reduction of desire, so that you can attain higher truth. So, according to Gandhian notion too, if you let the economy, if you give the economy a free rein, it is going to create problems. And what I propose to do is to discuss how this conflict between economy and society is attempted to be resolved in the in India in the succeeding lectures. Today, we are going to study how Indian economic policies have taken into account the conflict between economy and society. Right from the beginning, Indian Prime Minister, Indian governments have been emphasizing the importance of development, but always they have that always development has come with a rider, that is the rider of equality. So, the economy is not allowed to run on its own steam, as it were, without any control of the government. The government proposes to control the effects of economic development so that the social objectives, especially of equality, are met. Today, now we are in the age of globalization, as as many people would like to characterize this phase of our history. When you are talking about globalization, we need to understand that globalization has been an ancient phenomenon, but as I would discuss subsequently, contemporary globalization has certain important features which globalization did not have in the past. Globalization, in the beginning of globalization, I suppose you can trace it to the conquest of Alexander. Alexander wanted to conquer the whole world. This was in the ancient, this is part of ancient history. Subsequently, of course, there has been, colonialism, the phase of colonialism, which also shrank the world together, brought the world together. And we are now in the third phase of globalization. The contemporary globalization has compressed the world and made it into, the people say, we are living in a global village. Because of instantaneous means of communication, digital communications, which enable us to contact anybody we want. We are hooked to the world. We can phone up anybody across the world and talk to them instantaneously. There has been this revolution of the internet and so on. This has facilitated greater commerce, and the economy, Indian economy also has opened up, and there have been several radical changes that have come about due to globalization. What's very interesting is that in spite of globalization, the emphasis of Indian governments, there have been in India, we have had a succession of different kinds of governments. Right now, we have the National Democratic Alliance government, which is dominated by the BJP. This, as we all know, has replaced the United Progressive Alliance led by the Congress Party, and there have been a successive of different alliances which have come to power, especially after 1990. The NDA government first came to power with Prime Minister Vajpayee as the first NDA government came to power in 1998, when Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee was elected as the Prime Minister of the country. So, this is the second NDA government which has come to power. Now, with this in this new phase of globalization, the markets have opened, and the point that's made is that the markets have not only opened, the Indian market has been opened up to the world, and we can freely import and export goods and services. Not only that, we have given a great deal of emphasis on the private sector. Earlier, during the era of planning, the emphasis was on the public sector commanding the heights of the economy, public sector and the government commanding the heights of the state, commanding the heights of the economy. Today, it is that we give considerable scope for the private sector to operate. This is called free enterprise, and there is free competition. Private enterprises from all over the world can come and invest, provided they follow the rules of the government, and private enterprises in India also can compete with them, and the market, the forces of demand and supply in the market determine what should be the price of various commodities, goods and services. This is the big change in with globalization. The point is that as globalization, as this privatization proceeds, we expect the role of the government to shrink, and the government has come away. The government is thinking of is continuously thinking of privatizing the public sector units. I will have occasion to mention why these public sector enterprises came up in the first place. When I trace back the way in which the government's policies have evolved. But today, more and more sectors are open for the private enterprise, and those enterprises which were public sector, which were in the hands of the government, they are now being privatized. They are being sold to private investors. Now, although this is going on, this privatization is going on, what is happening to the role of the government? Very curiously, the government, as the privatization proceeds, as the market comes to dominate the economic force, economic operations, economic activities, what you see here is that the government's role has not shrunk. In fact, it has expanded, especially the government's role as a regulator, as a referee, to ensure there is fair competition. And not only that, the government's commitment to equality, continues. You may think that after 2014, there has been a sudden change in the approach of the government, because it formally in 2014, after 2014, when the new government came to power, NDA government came to power, it abolished the planning commission. Planning commission, which used to formulate 5-year plans for the country, it was abolished, and in its place a new entity called the Niti Aayog has been instituted, whose job is to offer strategic advice to the government on matters of it on matters of important concern. Having said that, the government's government's role in the economy continues, not only because of because it is acting as a regulator, but the government also has a vital stake in ensuring that the fruits of economic development reach reach everyone, and especially the poor in the country. So the pro-poor policies which have been in place since 1967 onwards continue even today. Now, the government has this legacy, and it carries this legacy, and it proposes to effectively implement, to make sure that the anti-poverty programs are taken up in a big way, so that there won't be any necessity for in the future there won't be any necessity for the government to initiate anti-poverty programs. That poverty incidence of poverty comes down so dramatically that we need not have any special programs to eradicate poverty. That is the intention of the government. The government's intention, as I had mentioned earlier, is the government's approach is contained in this phrase "Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas." And I can list the number of programs the government has initiated in this regard. For instance, soon after the NDA government came to power, it started this, it announced that it will open bank accounts for everyone. And the government has opened up bank accounts for everyone under the scheme called the Jan Dhan Yojana. In this scheme, everyone can go and open an account in the savings account in a bank, and even when they can't make any deposits in their accounts. It is now the data show that so far 21 crore accounts, bank accounts were opened up within 1.5 years of the program being announced, and of these 21 crore accounts, 12.87 crore accounts were in rural areas. And although it was a zero account program, the amount of money that's been deposited in these accounts has been to the order of 33,074.89 crores of rupees. So, this is one of the programs that the government launched, which is also aimed at the poor. It has also launched programs for girl children, and it has launched programs for micro enterprises, so that non-corporate small businesses gain get the capital. The government gives loans of around concessional loans of around from anywhere from rupees 50,000 to rupees 10 lakhs for these micro enterprises. Then there is the rural roads program, and one can list the insurance program for all. So one can list a whole lot of programs that the government has undertaken, which has a component aimed directly at the poor. And more importantly, there are other programs which the government has taken up, that is also supposed to lift everyone, including the poor, above the poverty line. Lift the poor above the poverty line and lift everyone, enhance the standard of life of everyone, so that Achhe Din that was promised by the Prime Minister would be realized. My task now is not to evaluate so much the performance of the government with its various schemes. My task is to point out that the stress on poverty alleviation, on poverty eradication continues. In this, you may remember the Prime Minister had made a statement earlier that the rural employment generation scheme, which was known as the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Generation Scheme, this Mahatma Gandhi is called, people talk about it as, refer to it in its short form as Manrega. This scheme, it was said that it is a shame that this scheme is at all needed, after 70 years after 60 years of independence, because that shows that we have not been effective in eradicating poverty. But the present regime has not given up on this scheme, although it is regarded as a blot on our economic performance, on our country as a whole. It has not given it up. It continues with the scheme. You see, what the government has proposes to do is to make targeting of the beneficiaries of the scheme more efficient. Targeting of the beneficiaries of the scheme more efficient, so that instead of the funds reach so that the funds which used to be leaking out to middlemen of all sorts and encourage corruption, the funds directly go to the people, the beneficiaries, the poor, to whom these funds were meant. You remember that when Rajiv Gandhi was the Prime Minister, he had made a comment that out of every 1 rupee that the government spends on, the government spends on poverty eradication, only 15 paise reaches the poor. So the government wants to ensure that the remaining 85 paise also reach the poor and do not go to the corrupt petty officials and other vested interests, so that the poverty is effectively eliminated. For this purpose, the government has used the scheme of Aadhaar, by which everyone gets an Aadhaar card, an identification card, and this card could be used to open bank accounts, and using the digital means, the modern means of digital communication, it's possible to directly transfer the money to the poor, to directly ensure that the poor get the rations also, that is the food that is given concession in at concessional prices, also the poor will get without the food grains leaking out to undesirable antisocial elements. Similarly, this scheme has also been used to ensure that midday meal schemes for the children all over the country, for school children, are efficiently organized. And as you all know, that it was discovered several thousand, about 35 to 40,000 using this Aadhaar scheme. It was discovered that there were several teachers who were on the payroll who did not exist, and they were getting money from the government, although these were these teachers, there were no such teachers at all. Somebody else was making in their name, in their proxy names, they used to draw the salaries of teachers, although there was no teachers employed. So, the idea of this approach, the idea of this government has been to target the poor by using digital electronic means. And this has raised some controversies, that can we really achieve this, or in the name of targeting we are leaving out vast sections of the poor. These are questions which we will have to discuss. But as I said, my main intention is to discuss how the society's pressures are working or being applied, society's pressures through the government are being applied in controlling the economic processes. And in this government is continuing the policies, and it say policies of the previous governments, and it says that it is doing it more efficiently. Now, why is it? Now this question to ask for us is that why is it that we are talking about poverty? All right? This is a very big question. Why is it that we are, you see, it was in 1967 that Indira Gandhi, won the elections, general elections with a thumping majority by using the slogan Garibi Hatao. Since 1967, the government has been following this policy of abolishing poverty. It is reported that because we adopted this policy of abolishing poverty, we have reduced the extent of poverty. In the previous Manmohan Singh government, there was a claim that our poverty has been reduced to less than 25%. That is, that earlier in 1951, our poverty rate was more than 50%, and now it has been reduced to 25%. That means that those who are regarded as extremely poor, they draw a what shall I say, a line, an income. They calculate the amount of income that a poor needs, that a poor person household needs for its sustenance, and its food, clothing and shelter. On that basis, they will calculate how many people are getting an income less than this amount, and on that basis they calculate the number of poor. And according to estimates, in at the turn of the when soon after independence, naturally more than 50% of the population, more than 50%, was under the category of poor. Now, with all these development programs in this 21st century, around 2010, 2009, 2010, there was a big controversy about it. They said that poverty has been reduced from 50%, it has come down to 25%. There was a big controversy about that, because many people argued that the amount, that the income that they estimate that a poor person requires, is so low that it will not be possible for an ordinary human being to live. So the government is actually using these poverty estimates, the government is actually throwing wool over the eyes of people. It has not been very successful. That was the big criticism. But because of that, I think subsequently the government has not really been talking about reduction of poverty, but it should be now the poverty, according to new calculations, the poverty the incidence of poverty is supposed to be around 30%. All right. But anyway, this question is not poverty as such. This question is also, along with poverty, there is this question of inequality. Inequality of income and wealth. All right. In the past, that is in the early days soon after independence, it was thought that India was a poor country, poor economy. It was underdeveloped. It was an underdeveloped economy because it was because of colonialism. Colonialism meant that in the British rule, for instance, what happened was that the British government systematically exploited our economy by extracting our natural resources, and exporting and getting them imported to Britain at low rates. And not only that, coupled with this import of raw materials from India, especially cotton, jute and so on, coupled with this, the the imperial country, that is Britain, sold us manufactured goods that are manufactured in the British factories, all right, manufactured goods at exorbitant prices. so that there was a drain on the Indian economy. We had to give more than what we actually received in terms of benefits, and this is called the drain theory. And because of that, how did this drain get come into effect? The government used to impose heavy land revenues, and taxes to extract wealth and income from the people. The government did not pay much attention to development projects in the country. It was not interested in development, irrigation, in improving agriculture, and so on and so forth. So therefore, Indian economy was really devastated by the British colonial rule. There is some evidence, during from 1900 to 1951, if you see the growth of agricultural growth in the country, it was hardly in the realm of around 0.5%. So there was stagnation. Indian economy on the whole was stagnating during colonial rule. There was stagnation, which is, this economic stagnation was such that it was not only extraction of Indian resources, it also left the Indian economy incapable of generating more income, more wealth, more goods and services, because the structure of extraction was such that it did not encourage production. In fact, it tried to control production, it tried to curb production. I will give you the example of this. The British introduced the zamindari system, in agriculture. They, auctioned zamindari entitlements to wealthy people, so that of huge tracts of land, and they allowed the zamindars to collect revenue from the people and use the peasants as their serfs, use give out land to tenants at very unfair terms, so that they get more money to transfer to the British government. So you must have all seen the film Lagan, which was actually based on that on this notion of extraction of revenue from the people. Now, the burden of revenue was so much, the peasants did not have the capital to invest in agriculture and increase yields, agricultural yields. In India we can have 3 crop seasons, unlike in Europe, in the temperate climates, and in America, where you can only have 1 agricultural season. In spite of that, our agricultural yields started declining, because there was this the land revenue demands were so much by the government and from the zamindars, that the peasants did not have enough funds to invest in improving agricultural productivity, increasing agricultural productivity, in bringing in undertaking irrigation works, and so on. Not only that, it also happened that because of this exorbitant demands for land revenue, it is also, between the zamindar and the peasant who actually tills the soil, there were several intermediaries. In Bengal, it was reported that there were about 70 intermediaries between the, that had come up between the zamindar on the one hand, and the tiller on the other, tiller the extreme. The tiller is the one who tills the land. The zamindar is the one who collects the revenue, collects the revenue of the land from the tiller. So that zamindar employed a, zamindar had such vast tracts of land, he had to employ middlemen to collect the rent on his behalf, collect the rent and revenue on his behalf, and the intermediaries lower down the order, they had other intermediaries and so on. It's a kind of a pagdi system that had evolved. So, if with all this pagdi system that's evolving, what happened was that because of these intermediaries and with the pagdi system, the extraction, if you work hard on your land and produce produce an amount of agricultural, let's say food grain, and if much of it, more than 50% of it is taken away by the intermediaries, when agricultural rents from the tenants is high, and when the zamindar collects high proportion of revenue, the incentive for production gets reduced, and the peasant will find it not remunerative to increase his yields. So, under the circumstances, the entire system that had come up of intermediaries, were the ones, a few intermediaries were benefiting at the expense of vast masses of people. This is not only true of agriculture, this is also true of industry. There was some industries, jute industries, jute and cotton textile industries had come up in in Bengal, in jute industry in Bengal, and jute textile industries in Bengal, and cotton textile industries in the then Bombay and Madras, presidencies had come up, and even there the market, in the case of cotton textile industries, this was different, but basically it was the market wasn't really open for competition. And even if you look at the industrial records, you will find that there was a number of intermediaries between the worker and the man who recruits the workers. And then permanent jobs were so very scarce. You had to work for a certain number of years to gain the status of a permanent employee, that there would be in Bombay, there would be queues for becoming with queues of workers who would be lined up as badlis. There would be long queues of workers for badli labor. That is, when the permanent laborers go away for to their villages, then these temporary workers will be appointed at a lower wage. But whatever it is, what I want to emphasize here is that the system, that the colonial system had produced an economy which was strangulating production, because it had led to the growth of certain monopoly interests, in whose interest it was to actually depress production so that they can extract more. So, when the government took over, when the independent India's government took charge, when we had elections on the basis of universal adult franchise, then there was a big break, and we hoped that our colonial economy will get back onto the growth path. Incidentally, I should mention here that prior to the colonial rule, Indian economy was one of the leading economies in the world. By the time the British left, our share of world trade was around 2%. Before the British colonized our economy, our share of world trade was more than 25%. We were a rich country, and in fact, colonial expeditions to India and to other parts of the world started because the West had heard of the prosperity of India. India was regarded as the golden land, and Indian economy was booming during the pre-British times. Therefore, the colonial rule acted as a rule which constrained our productive abilities. Not only that, I think colonial rule also inculcated in us a sense of inferiority, that we cannot compete with the West, and that we have inherently certain defects. That is why we lost actually our ability to, we became the subjects of the British Empire. The Britishers, all right, this is another thing, other important feature of colonialism. The British government in Britain had democracy, right. The government, the people of Britain were the citizens. They had rights of citizenship rights, whereas the British, while they were practicing democracy at home, they practiced imperialism abroad. In India, they considered Indians as the subjects of the British Empire. What is subject of the British Empire? That means that we are not capable of exercising our independent choice, and that they had this notion also that they have to, the British had the civilizing mission. They used to say that India was a backward economy, backward society, and that they have, their mission in ruling India was to civilize the population. That was their aim. But actually they made sure that in the although they claimed that they were civilizing us, they actually made sure that we became poorer and poorer, so that we can subject ourselves to accept the dominance of the British government. But having said this, now soon after we attained independence, of course our interest was to ensure that our economy, we develop. You see the during the British rule, there used to be famines almost every year in one part of the country or the other, and this also made sure that Indian people did not get enough nutrition. And of course, you all know that there was that notorious famine of 1942, which took a toll of more than 2 million people, Bengalis, and it was the number of people dead in the 1942 famine is reported was much more than the number of people killed in the Second World War. So Indian economy was in a weak position when India became independent, and it was we did not have adequate what shall I say, our agriculture did not have the capacity to produce adequate food for the people, and it was we were being told that India is an overpopulated country, people don't work, all right. People don't have a work ethic and so on and so forth to say why India is remained a poor country. Therefore, the government started talking about development, but development as such, it was realized development as such will not, it was realized that development as such will not make any headway unless we also tackled the poverty. It was realized at that time that first of all we need to produce more. If there is a small cake, all right, and if you divide it, what you find, if you divide it, even if you want to divide it equally, everyone will get a small portion of the cake, all right. But the problem is that it can't feed a large population. Therefore, you have to keep enlarging the size of the cake so that more and more people can have a bigger and bigger share of the cake, other resources. So, the first task was to opt for rapid economic growth. The first task was to opt for rapid economic growth. Along with it, it was argued that there should be distributive justice. Once we start increasing the size of the cake, then we can talk about distributive justice. Then we can talk about how to share what we have produced, in a just manner, so that our inequalities are reduced. This was the first approach of the first 15 years. It was the slogan then was economic growth with distributive justice. Economic growth with distributive justice placed distributive justice at a lower level than economic growth. The emphasis was first on growth and then on distribution, because without distribution there can't be enough to, without economic growth there can't be enough to feed the people. Now, the government pursued the ideal of socialist pattern of society. I will explain what this is, what this meant, but the idea was that you should, even as you promote economic growth, you can do a few things, institutional changes you can bring about to ensure that the benefits of economic growth are reach the poor. Therefore, for economic growth and economic growth with justice was economic growth with distributive justice, the role of the state becomes very important. Economic growth with distributive justice, the role of the state becomes very important for this reason, because it is the state which should ensure that distributive justice is done. And in order that the distributive justice is done, the state has to control the economy. in such a way that the goals of the state, that is the socialist pattern of society, are attained, all right, and distribution is made possible. Everyone gets equal income and so on. So, this was the idea. Incidentally, the philosophy at that time was that if development comes about, if we concentrate on economic growth, all right, on increasing the rate of economic growth, we bring about development, all right, and with this, what is this development was all about? With this development, our old ways of life, all right, old ways of life, our belief systems, all right, all these things, systems, our blind, blind beliefs, all of them will be wiped. Our superstitions, all these things will be wiped out, and that means, according to this idea of socialist development, the existing institutions of the society, caste will be, caste practices, caste discrimination, all these will be wiped away, as because people, when they become more and more developed, then what happens is they become more and more rational. They also become educated. Development is also means that they will be, they'll be going to schools and colleges. They'll learn science, and they'll become technologies. They'll learn engineering, become doctors, and so on. As more and more rationality spreads, all right, not only through doctors and engineers, but through new industries that are coming up, new ways of increasing agricultural output and so on, people will become more and more rational, and they would give up the notions of caste, that you should marry only within your caste, and that you should follow certain rituals, that your belief in superstitions will eliminate. You will become very modern, the modern individuals, and there will be more spread of modernity, there will be modernization. Our country, all of us will become like people in the United States of America or in Europe. We will be rich people, we will be very our approach, and we will be contributing more and more for development. So, this was the idea of rationality and idea of modernization.